All right, since we have a small group, I just want to take a pulse so we know who you are. How many of you are work for our manufacturing apps? What? Devices? Medical devices? Medical device manufacturers? Mobile device manufacturers? How many are from healthcare organizations, like a hospital? Healthcare, what, okay, where? Oh, okay. Other, academics, teachers, researchers, government, just to see if you're awake back there. Okay. What? Philanthropists, yes. Anybody have money? We'll pass a hat. I'm Mary Logan, president of AAMI, affectionately known as AAMI, Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. Are you members? How many are members of AAMI? Woohoo! Thank you. There's information about AAMI at the front of the room for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are primarily known as a standards development organization in the medical device space. We do a lot of other things. We have a lot of clinical engineers and biomedical engineers and biomedical engineering technicians who work in hospitals as members. But we are primarily known as an SDO, Standards Development Organization. We are a neutral convener. We're often known as Switzerland or an honest broker because we don't have an advocacy role at all. We don't lobby anybody for anything. So that allows the FDA to work with us, and we believe that standards are better when they are developed in a multidisciplinary way with industry, clinicians, engineers from hospitals, independent experts, and government all working together to decide what the standards should be. We have been holding a summit on a key technology issue for the last 3 years, 2010 on infusion devices, 2011 on alarm safety, 2012 on interoperability in and around medical devices. The FDA is a co-convener of these events with us, and we decided that this year the Interoperability Summit was so important that we wanted to bring it to those of you at the mHealth Summit who might not have been at the Interoperability Summit. So that's what this session is all about. This is a panel. I'm not going to keep talking very much longer. And we want this to be interactive. So I have questions that I'm going to ask the panelists. I'll introduce you to them very quickly. But I have questions I'm going to ask them, and we want you to ask them questions also. So this is a small group. It's friendly. Please interrupt. We don't have a set flow. They have an idea of what I'm going to ask them, and they might redirect and try to answer something else, which they think is important, which is always the prerogative of the speaker, right? But we want you to ask questions too. So if somebody says something that prompts a question from you, wave your arm, and I'll try to moderate, but we'll just be very friendly here and keep it informal. And if there's a topic that you want us to cover, we don't want to wait until the very end just to get to your question. Just raise your hand and ask when you think it makes sense when it's related to something that we're talking about. So the four-legged stool, if you will, is sitting in the room here. Heather Agler or Adler? Agler. Right? Heather Agler is with the FDA, CDRH, and she's originally at the FDA from the Office of Device Evaluation. She now works in the Center Director's Office, and interoperability is now a major thing for her. John Rhodes is with Philips Healthcare. He is a very knowledgeable guy about standards, about the IHE, the Connectathon, IHE profiles, and what it takes to have good interoperability with medical devices. How'd I do there, John? Great. Elliot Sloan is an independent expert, clinical engineer. He has a foot kind of in the medical device space and also in the IT space, clinical engineer by training, a lot of experience in hospitals, a lot of experience now on the IT side, and I call him a bridge. He's a bridge role. Julian Goldman is a clinician, an MD from Partners Healthcare, and interoperability has been his life's work. He has been dreaming about getting to this space for many years, and he's had to be a nag for many years. And finally, I think his time has come when he doesn't have to nag quite so much. Or maybe he'll move on to nagging about something else. So this is the four-legged stool of what we like to see in standards development. If AAMI believes very strongly, if you only have one perspective, if you only hear from industry, you're going to get a very slanted view on how they see the world. Same thing if you only hear from Julian or if you only hear from Heather. Elliot's probably the most independent as a bridge, but he comes at things from an engineering role, so he sees the world differently than they do too. So we wanted to have all of them. I know nothing other than how to ask a lot of questions. So here we go. Oh, and we have slides, but we're not going to, I don't know why they're not up there. But the slides are mainly as a handout. We're not going to, they're just general background information. We're not going to go through them. You can download them if you want. There are just a few of them. And the last thing I'm going to say is we have a publication coming out that synthesizes the summit, the Interoperability Summit. It will be out by the end of the year. And that will be a much expanded version of what we talk about today. And hopefully we cover all the themes from that today. And that will be free of charge to anybody who wants it. If you want to be sure you get it, give me your business card and we'll add you to the list. Okay, so our focus is on medical devices, getting patient safety right, interoperability, the convergence of those things. I'm going to start with a question to all the panelists. They all attended the summit, so I'm going to ask what their biggest takeaway was from the summit. And I'll start with Julian. We'll just go down, each one of you, down the row.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for having me today. I had to nag Mary for 3 months before I was invited to, no, just kidding. No nagging involved. I'm happy to participate. So the summit, well, for those who weren't there, they wouldn't realize just how many people and from how many different backgrounds were all participated talking about interoperability. And for me, I found it very exciting that after interoperability being an esoteric term that people couldn't pronounce, didn't know why they would bother to pronounce it, and didn't know why it was important, to see that there was now a rallying around interoperability as an essential ingredient for the next phase of improving the quality and safety of healthcare. So one of the takeaways for me was the fact that it happened and that there was diverse presence. Another takeaway was the ongoing challenge of having people speak about use the same words but mean entirely different things. And the fact that it's still so difficult to envision, to talk about, is, I think, brought on by the lack of clarity of what the future state of healthcare could look like. And I think that isn't surprising. When one looks at enabling technologies, and one looked at the beginning of the Internet and of hyperlinks, it was pretty exciting on your DOS screen, but there were not many people who appreciated how it would transform the world. And that is what interoperability holds as a promise in healthcare. But similarly, it really takes an effort to tease out and to have vision to get a sense of what the end state will look like in order to try to get there. And certainly we saw that at the summit as well. And so I think there's a lot more nurturing and direction that will be required to ensure that we get through this fairly complex navigate this complex path to get to where it will really make a difference as opposed to just be cool and interesting.
Thank you also for inviting me and for putting on and hosting the summit, because it really was an extraordinary opportunity. I think there were about 350 people, and as Julian said, from all different parts of healthcare and all different parts of industry and all different parts of the government. And I came away with a couple of fundamental thoughts. And I guess I've been working on interoperability for about a dozen years, very directly, medical device interoperability and electronic health record system interoperability. One realization was that the field is expanding and changing at a velocity that I can't quite comprehend. I mean, if you look downstairs at the show floor, that's one vector of development. Technologies that are dealing with blood pressure, diabetes management, that deal with personal health records, electronic health records. Another vector is the bring your own device environment where clinicians are being encouraged by the hospitals to bring their own computational capabilities, display, simulation. And then there is the very strictly medical device dimensions. One of Julian's areas is working on very tightly coupled, very safe, integrated clinical technologies in an integrated clinical environment. Many of my colleagues are working on more loosely coupled, integrated clusters of tools, extensible sets of tools that work with electronic medical records. So the directions are going off at an incredible rate, and then the other area that is kind of mildly frustrating is that the newcomers often are so breathlessly excited they haven't had a chance to even ask, what do you all know about this field and how can we sort of extend your knowledge, but they're starting with a tabula rasa and starting over with, what's a heartbeat and what's a blood pressure. And so there's a moment in time where there's more chaos than we had, I think, ever expected. But I'm hopeful I think the summit helped have a little more of that discussion, and I think it will precipitate more important discussions along those lines.
Well, I think, to me, one of the really important words of the meeting was chaos, as Elliot just, not that the meeting was particularly chaotic, but it represents a field of endeavor that is very complex. And I've been involved in medical device software and medical device interoperability, also about a dozen years. Now there's a whole lot more attention. People know the jargon a little bit, and there are a lot of new efforts starting up. I, like Elliot, get a little frustrated that some people don't do their homework and realize what's there already and start reinventing wheels very fast. But that's okay. That'll shake itself out. But maybe the biggest single thing was that the group recognized that the technical part of the stuff is not the hard part. A lot of those problems are solved or can easily be solved using methods that we as engineers know a lot about. But it's all embedded in how hospitals are organized, how different clinical people interact, how industry interacts with clinicians, interacts with, et cetera. It's just a very complicated picture, and we need to get different kinds of specialties involved. Not all, in technical or clinical backgrounds, but also, how do we make this work on the grand national scale? How do we get the incentives right for people to do the right things? This all happens within a very complicated matrix of social, political, economic forces that none of us is able to deal with alone. It's, as a couple people said at the meeting, it's not a technical problem, it's a socio-technical problem. That might not be the best word for it, but the essential idea is there. So it's very interesting times.
So John just articulated two of the Clarion themes that will be in the Summit publication for the kind of highest priority issues at the Summit. One, focus on human behavior first. It's complex socio-technical system, and then align incentives, roles, expectations, and responsibilities. There was a really big drumbeat about misaligned incentives. So thanks. That was two. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to also comment about the summit really nicely laid out sort of the complexity of the issue, and that was first reflected in the attendees from all the different backgrounds that were there, whether it was clinicians or hospitals or healthcare systems, engineers, regulators, all different peoples with all different backgrounds and their different roles in this particular issue. And I thought that was really fascinating from our point of view. We don't see, from the regulatory standpoint, all the issues and barriers that are seen in hospitals, and this nicely laid them out. And we don't always get to see the complexity that hospitals have to deal with when they're trying to set up these systems. One thing that was really, I thought, fascinating, too, was the hospitals that did present that are going down this path, all the complexities and all the things that they had to think about, whether even it's just broadband for their Wi-Fi, and they're bringing their own devices in and opening that up to like viruses and other security issues and problems like that that are really beyond what the FDA does. But in the end, if you're going to connect medical devices eventually on a system, you know, may eventually be something that you need to think about from a medical device point of view. And so I thought it was a really fascinating conference, and it was really nice to see sort of people put together what are the issues, what are the barriers, and I'm sure that we still could list even more than what was spoken in that particular summit. But it was enlightening, because for the FDA, what we're really trying to see is how can we promote interoperability, and what is our role, and what can we do to encourage people to integrate devices so that they can speak to electronic health records and such, and do it in a safe and effective way. And that's what we were most concerned about.
Julian looks like he wants to add something.
I do. Yes, mind
Go
reader.
for it.
So I would add caution to the notion of that this isn't a tough technical problem, and it's, you know, the challenge is because of the social aspect. I think it is inadequate to treat this solely as a technical problem, because there are because of the misaligned incentives and the social aspect. But the fact that there are deep technical challenges that remain is a fact. The thing is, we can't solve those deep technical challenges if we don't have alignment of incentives and move things forward.
Chicken and egg. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's I think it's a little dangerous if we, you know, oversimplify by saying this isn't really a technical problem, because, for example, if we just to give a specific example, the facilitation of transmission of clinical alarms on handheld devices, remote devices, and so forth is of great interest to many hospitals today. The lack of interoperability complicates the ability to glue together different systems to send a message end to end. But having interoperability, whether it's semantic interoperability and syntactic interoperability, and all the way down to whatever's needed, is an essential ingredient. But handling the technical complexity of delivering an alarm within a required 10-second period, for example, isn't a trivial matter. So, but we can't get to work on that until we at least agree that we need to glue the pieces together, because there's clinical value and incentives for patient care. So I think it's worth you know, kind of thinking about this from a system perspective with all its complexity.
So I think Julian just touched on another one of the Clarion themes, standardize to achieve success. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about clinical workflow yet. So I'd like to ask John, I think, to address this one in terms of why was that such a big issue, standardize to achieve success? Some folks talked about that there are a lot of variations in HL7, for example. But overall, what what is the issue with standardizing? I mean, I think Julian just sort of touched on it too. Would you comment on it from an industry perspective and from what you see participating in the IHE?
Well, it's partly providing a way to express things, which is something that HL7 does reasonably well, but it's also getting agreement on what it is that you need to express, you know, what the underlying semantics are, what the best way to organize your, you know, bundle of data is, and what uses are going to be made of it. And then there's a lot of complexity in articulating different standards with each other, because there are a lot of different people working in a lot of different venues with different goals, expertise, and so on. This can lead to divergence, and it can lead to, you know, poor communication. It's its own complicated ecosystem, the standards world.
Elliot, and I think Julian wants to say something too. I can tell.
On the technical standard side, everything John has talked about, plus the electronic health record, which is now often a major part of the nervous system and informatics system of hospitals, and how those standards are also not hammered down yet. Meaningful use stage 1 or 2, if you're familiar with those from the hospital setting, are very low bars, very, very, very low bars for performance of electronic health record or medical record systems, or interoperability of those systems. So the things we're plugging into are not well standardized. And then the context of the use is truly chaotic. I've set up intensive care, neonatal intensive care systems in patients' homes. And you look at that and you scratch your head, and you know that the manufacturer of that ventilator never in their wildest dreams thought that that ventilator would be taken into a very modest home, very poor power conditioning, a compressor literally put in a basement without any kind of climate control or fungus or other controls, and the number of environmental challenges alone, let alone cleanliness in the space where the very sick baby was, and the fatigue of the parents to all day and all night alarms with pulse oximeters and apnea monitors and the ventilators themselves. There are a lot of changes happening in our health delivery system. There's a lot of, you can't fix everything simultaneously. You've got to stabilize some things, and so to the extent we can, everywhere we can insert and agree on standards reduces the variability further, so that we have a better chance of having understood outcomes or risks and patient safety, and that those are all very big concerns in medical device interoperability.
Julian.
Sure. Actually wasn't planning on saying something, but now. So it's probably worth mentioning that before I comment on standards, I should mention that I chair the ISO Standards Committee, ISO Technical Committee 121, and also ASTM F29 as a user vice chair, so I feel completely comfortable criticizing standards. having chaired or written more than I can count. When we look at the world of standards, we see interesting development in what drives a standard. So sometimes it's an industry consortium forming and deciding that we need a new standard for the web, or we need a new standard for communication. We need something that ultimately became Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or something like that. And usually industry has joined together, thought about the market opportunities, thought about the landscape, and then kind of driven that forward, and then they iterate a few times as they see market adoption. Then there are other standards, especially medical device standards, that are developed after the devices have been in the market for a while. And what they do is they tend to codify existing practice, ventilators and a whole host of other things. And there, it's just the very nature of the development. It takes years of developing and creating and refining and tweaking, and then people make mistakes in development and, of these devices across kind of the ecosystem. And then everybody gets together and says, you know, it's stable enough, and let's work on a standard. So I think we have to kind of be aware that standards happen in different ways for different purposes, depending upon the implications. And it's kind of easier, in a sense, with trial and error with software standards than it is with hardware and all the clinical experience that's required to understand the performance. So that's kind of, I think, a piece of the complexity here is that, so why did I mention those examples? With both of them, there's a pretty clear idea of what you intend to achieve. And with the hardware standards for devices, those devices are there, they're in use, people know what they do. And with these other standards, there's a pretty clear idea of what the opportunity is when the consortium is formed that develops the standards. They have use cases and they understand. Interoperability hasn't had that benefit. It's been a mixture of aggregating from the bottom up in terms of projects and opportunities, and some top-down that have been driven by federal regulation, and some that have been introduced by consortia. And this is an unbelievably complex ecosystem that doesn't have the benefit of these other settings. And that's part of the reason that we're seeing different phases of development for different work, different standards, and I'll say kindly, an amalgam. Not a mess, an amalgam.
So I'm going to ask one more question of all of you, and then I'll switch gears. What is the biggest patient safety risk with device interoperability that you heard articulated at the summit? And do you agree that that's the biggest risk? And how would you advise this audience to address that risk? That's Heather. Oh, Elliot. Okay.
You can go.
Oh, it doesn't matter. I was just going to say that the biggest risk that I kept hearing and that I guess from a device point of view that I'm concerned about was to hear about connected devices having a signal basically delayed or corrupted when it got to the end user that might be, let's say in this case, like monitoring a patient, so that the patient may have delay of care. And I believe there was an example of a woman who had low blood pressure, and the information that got presented, it did not show up, and how they were monitoring the patient. And then by the time it was discovered that the patient care was delayed. And so I think that's our biggest concern, is any time that once you connect these devices, you're depending upon that connection to treat a patient and somehow get erroneous information, whether it's time delayed, so you get it after the fact, or it's wrong information. I mean, that's really what we're concerned about, is the patient safety aspect of this. I mean, we do hope that eventually interoperability will lead to more efficient care, safety as well, and hopefully better patient outcomes. I think that's what we all want it to lead to, but right now at this stage I think we're more concerned about those types of safety issues.
I'd like to sort of expand on that, Heather. I agree with you, and I think more generally the issue that's lurking, the 800-pound gorilla or elephant in the room, whichever metaphor you want to use, is there are interdependencies in these systems and in the infrastructure around these systems, whether it's wireless or wired networks or the EHR, that we're only beginning to understand the interaction of all of those systems that may delay a signal. What happens if there's a drug-drug interaction and that drug just isn't in the library of the system? There's a lot of checks and interlocks in jet aircraft, trains, toys, consumer products that are based on a very closed engineering spec. And when you have an open ecosystem, you have to have some different rules of the road. And it's not like we don't have experience with that. I mean, we do have rules that are designed to keep one plug being plugged in an electrical outlet from bringing the entire electrical system in your neighborhood down. Rules that prevent one cable adapter from being connected to the cable network from bringing the entire cable network down. There are a lot of structural rules, infrastructure rules that we have yet to develop for the interoperable medical device field. And that's a serious risk that's latent in the technologies, and there's a lot of assumptions that are made, one of which is that the device itself, the original medical device, will remain competent or sane or safe or trustworthy when it's connected to other devices. But you have to have a pretty honest, open discussion to even get to that point, and you don't necessarily know all the possible dimensions of interactions that could happen that could create an unsafe situation. And my colleague to my left, to your right, probably has a list as long as my arm of all the things that can happen, and has worked really, really hard to try to come up with a context of very safely interconnected and interlocking systems. And when I talk about loose ecosystems, he gets quite uncomfortable.
Not at all. So thank you. John, I didn't want to jump in front of you if you were.
Go ahead.
We spent several years absolutely looking at the implications of safety with interoperability. And I think actually the way that I'd prefer to frame this type of analysis is that what we have going on today is ad hoc device and system integration. And that has significant risks, significant safety concerns. So, for example, in my lab, we connected, we were pulling data from a commercial ventilator, and once we exceeded some arbitrary bandwidth, the ventilator shut down and reboot and stopped ventilating the mechanical lung. And this is exactly what would happen in, say, an ICU. So with devices today that haven't been designed and tested and don't have regulatory clearance or claims related to communication interoperability, what we have today is ad hoc integration. And it may be fine, and if it's very loosely coupled, and it may be safe, but it may not be, because that's loosely coupled. We're just requesting data from a ventilator, and it stops and reboots. I think that and the way we've framed much of the work we've been doing in our lab on interoperability is that our goal is safe interoperability. And it's not just a buzzword. It's actually, a lot of engineering effort going into this concept of safe interoperability, so that you have an idea of what the device's capabilities are and you don't exceed them when they're part of an interoperable system. So I think I would prefer that by definition, when we say interoperability, and we're saying it's medical device interoperability, we mean that from the ground up, we are creating a system intended to be interoperable, intended by the manufacturer, and therefore as safe as we possibly could make it. And I think the work that's being done in the standards realm jointly with AAMI and UL on certifying interfaces for future medical devices is going to help so that we'll understand what the capabilities and limitations of the interfaces are. So I don't think that interoperability, if it goes through a growing period and it's dangerous, that, like any medical device, ideally won't happen or shouldn't happen. But I wouldn't call that a byproduct of the interoperability. I'd say it's kind of the current state of where we are, which is inherently a problem. And it's it's complicated. We're talking about complex systems of systems, but there are many experts in these domains, especially from the DoD, people who work in aviation. They're used to very complex systems, and there are methods of addressing the risks that emerge when you start to create this. So anyway, without continuing, but I think differentiating between where we are with integration and safe interoperability is a critical aspect.
I object.
So, John, it's perfect that you're going last, because the first question I was going to ask you, was about system safety. So if you could, which was a big drumbeat at the Interoperability Summit. Nancy Levison was a speaker. Other speakers, including somebody from Lockheed, talked about system safety. So if you could add that to your answer, if you weren't going to touch on it anyway, we'll kill two birds with one stone here.
Okay, I wasn't going to try and answer the whole question, but I did want to make a plug to this group of practitioners that I see in front of me, based on one of Heather's examples, which is the woman. Now, complete the story. I think, as I remember, she died from sepsis.
Yes,
yeah.
she did.
Because people didn't realize that they were treating her on the basis of stale data. It wasn't getting refreshed. Something was reading the wrong value because it hadn't been updated. And it's something that I hope we all think about when we design systems, and I guess that's the segue into systems, that there's the need to spend a lot of thought and effort on the self-monitoring of the thing. You don't want to make a system that assumes that it's operating correctly. You want to have an independent set of functionality that's checking what's going on and giving you warnings about things like that. That has a little rule built in saying, okay, what was the timestamp on that reading on that patient? It's too old. Something's wrong. Let's call in the clinical engineer. That's the sort of thing that it's easy to underestimate, but is tremendously important. And I guess the connection to that, to the system engineering idea is we're all experienced in building single components that work reliably and safely, and that we can feel a lot of confidence in. But when you put these things together, the more you put together, the more links there are in between them. You can do more powerful and amazing things, but you're also getting yourself into a realm where there are behaviors that have to be looked at, studied, designed, researched, that none of the components by themselves have. I mean, this is kind of obvious. I'm sure everyone who's worked in engineering has some sense of this, but I think you need to delve a little deeper in the medical world than you probably ever really thought of, because these emergent properties of the systems, when you put them together, can really create huge safety problems.
So one of the things that I heard at last year's mHealth Summit in a session that included people from the FDA was that we need greater regulatory clarity in this area. And Heather, I'm going to ask you a question about that, but I want to comment, kind of link to what John just said to this. The FDA regulates devices, and they count on manufacturers to sort of self-regulate, if you will, the components of those devices. So the FDA doesn't regulate components. When you think about interoperability, though, the reality is that the medical device itself has now become a component. It's no longer a standalone. So who's regulating the end result, if you will? The components, some of the components are being regulated. We don't know yet if all the components are being regulated. But it just raises a question about whether the model that we've had historically for looking at regulation of medical devices will still work. So with that kind of backdrop and thinking, are we making progress in bringing regulatory to the field? And if so, how? And what can we all look forward to hearing from the FDA in the next 12 months about this? And I'm not putting her on the spot because she knew I was going to ask this question.
Yeah, I think when you talk about making systems with devices as components, it does get much more complex. And I'm not going to sit here to make a judgment call on whether all of a sudden, I'm not going to make that call about whether or not that requires an application or whatever. But I will tell you that we are really concerned about this area, and we are active, and some of that has been evident and has been out in the public domain. I mean, most of you are probably aware that we did have a draft guidance document on mobile medical apps and received public comment on that. And internally, they are taking into consideration those comments and trying to finalize a guidance on mobile medical apps, and we hope to see that in the near future. And another component of this is also clinical decision support software, which we are currently working on a guidance on as well. One that you probably would have been aware of, but maybe hadn't seen the movement on recently is wireless guidance. There had been a draft about 5 years ago, but that is moving along, and you should actually see that in the very near future too, a finalized wireless technology and medical devices guidance. Also, in terms of, we are constantly looking for ways to provide clarity and what is the best way to communicate our thoughts in this realm, and it is so complex, and it's in some ways at its infancy. I mean, we are building from the ground up. I mean, as you say, you know, we're people are just connecting medical devices and almost in some ways seeing what happens, and we're not a part of that realm. And I know I'm not saying people are just willy-nilly just putting them together and putting them to patients, but I know it's much more complex than that. But we are always looking for ways to clarify, and through the summit, I felt like we heard a lot of feedback about what was going on, and I did hear, you know, we would like to know what is the regulatory pathway, and I think I heard that particular phrase over and over, and we are trying to find ways in which we can help. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're looking over the list of the current interoperability standards and trying to figure out, is there a way that we can recognize some of these standards, and what would be the implications of that? Because in a lot of cases, they may apply to things that we don't necessarily regulate. You know, we don't tell you you need to use a certain type of coding when in your software or something like that, because what we care about more from a device perspective is that you went through a logical thought process with the software, and that you did a risk analysis, and then you did validation testing that works. But is there a way in which, if we would recognize something, that might be helpful to have in the labeling? These are just various ways that we are just exploring of how we might be able to help promote interoperability. And so we are actively working on that now. I'm trying to think if there was something else I wanted to say, but I think that's about it. But we are trying to look for ways to make clarity, to have clarity, and that's why we wanted to have the summit to begin with, is to sort of get that feedback and to know what's going on out there in the real world, as I should say, because we don't always hear what's going on in hospitals and in healthcare facilities, and this was a wonderful venue for us to get that type of feedback.
Elliot?
One of the other elephants in the room relates to the electronic medical record. And for 10 years I've said that it's a medical device. I've told Larry Kessler it's a medical device. I've raised this issue in many, many forums. It makes therapeutic and diagnostic recommendations. It has impact and risk for the patient. If it's not done properly, bad things can happen. It is one of the core parts of decision support, clinical care pathways, cost management, pharmacy and pharmacologic intervention, the nervous system that it runs, the networks that it's part of, the wireless and wired networks. More and more devices are connected and gathering data into those systems, and the metrology is being automated. And it's an uncomfortable place right now. It's a very uncomfortable place. It's because we are building these medical devices in hospitals in kind of one-off configurations. When you've been in one hospital, you've seen one hospital. And so that the regulatory challenge is not inconsequential. And some of the turf that has been divided in the past, I think we have to re-establish some of those divisions. Under the original American Hospital Association and Joint Commission guidelines, a lot of work was put into stabilizing the environment of care, the electricity, the hospital-grade outlets, red outlets for outlets with backup power, ranges of gas pressures, gas color coding, mechanical interlocks. Those didn't happen, as you pointed out. Those emerged after those technologies had been deployed in hospitals and more than a few bad things happened. And then we all learned what we had to do to kind of stabilize the environment of care so that medical device manufacturers could bring their products in with a much better sense of trust and a much better sense of design constraints. We're approaching that, I think, quickly in the medical framework that we're looking at today. We're seeing many more devices hung on wired and wireless networks. We're seeing many more app-based technologies coming into the hospital. And we're looking at this from top down, bottom up, sideways. And I think the bottom line that we've always seen is that whoever comes to work in the hospital or anyone who invents or provides products into healthcare never wakes up wanting to hurt anybody. You know, they never intended for something bad to happen, but these unintended consequences are lessons, hard-won lessons, that we really do have to bring back, learn from, and improve the environment quickly.
So I know John wanted to weigh in on our apps medical devices, and I see Julian wants to speak. So Julian, why don't you go first, and then John.
Speak to the regulatory point. In our research, you know, I wear a hat that's operational for Partners Healthcare. I have a hat that's a research lab on interoperability. And under NIH funding, we've been convening a group to look at some of the regulatory issues for interoperability with about 15 companies and other institutions. We submitted a pre-IDE on April 13th to the FDA for an interoperable medical device system. Now, it's a research prototype. Yeah, interoperable. Yeah, so it's a research prototype, not intended to be for a specific product, but it was. I'll give you one of them. It was intended to elaborate and help kind of to aggregate thinking around what are the implications for interoperable medical devices. So what we did is we said, here are some real devices, and let's make believe they're fully interoperable. What if these capabilities existed? What if there was reliable third-party certification? What if we had, you know, full capabilities with, you know, and things worked perfectly or as close to perfectly as they could? What are the implications for a hospital to assemble these devices at the point of care? What are the implications for running a new application, for example, a safety application related to infusion? And so this is in play right now, and the intent is to make it a public document as soon as we iron out the kind of kinks and get it right. And it will hopefully just help manufacturers then develop real products and go through the regulatory process in a more formal way. So we've been very grateful that the FDA has been willing to engage in this exploratory way. And I think we have to keep in mind that the way that we're doing things today is not acceptable. So if we do have new risks, we have to put them into perspective. So we've talked about the delayed blood pressure data resulting in a patient death. I am keenly aware of another patient death that occurred as the patient's infusion continued to run, set at the wrong setting. The patient had an arterial line displaying the blood pressure on a monitor, who knows where, at a nursing station at the bedside. The infusion pump keeps running and running and running until the patient died. And, you know, one would hope with smarter systems we'd have a way to stop an infusion that's killing a patient before it's too late. So it isn't as if we are okay today and we have to, you know, tread with great trepidation into the future, you know, keenly aware that we may increase the risk to the patient, but we, you know, can keep returning to where we are today as our safe home. The way we're doing things today is abominable. It does not leverage technology as it should. Now, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have complained about it, but we've had enough time, and we've had enough additional patient injuries and deaths, and we've made very little progress. And I, unfortunately, have to keep seeing these things happen. It's very frustrating. So, you know, for every one of these stories, there'll be many more, and we've got to really act.
John, do you want to add anything? And then I'm going to ask if anybody wants to ask or weigh in on this regulatory piece here or ask a question about it.
No, I just wanted to emphatically agree with what Elliot said, that electronic medical record systems are used to treat patients. You know, the data is used to treat patients. That's a medical device. And that has some implications for how you develop it. It doesn't, FDA has exercised regulatory discretion and it's very appropriate, to take into consideration promoting innovation and all of those things. But that doesn't mean that folks who are working on such systems, including mobile systems that are part of the loop of patient information, they're also part of the loop of patient safety, and they ought to be developed with the same kind of methodology, proper preparation of really, really good requirements, generating a design from that, building the product, verifying that it works as it's designed, and validating that it does what the users want it to do. That should apply to all of these things.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this, a very simple example in the standalone device world, but one of the tests in the 60601 standard, IEC 60601, which is the basic electromedical standard, one of the tests is humidity. So if you have a anesthesia machine, if you're making an anesthesia machine, you assume it's going to be used somewhere near a pump or an IV bag, and that bag could break and drip a lot of water on the anesthesia machine. So at the device design and testing and all of that stage, you make assumptions that bad things like that are going to happen. That's just one device and one scenario about one thing that could happen to get it wet. You add this complexity of thinking about how and where the app is going to be used or whatever it is, and it's just compounded geometrically. Audience, questions about regulations? Usually this is where people want to ask Heather questions.
Hardball, stand up.
Yes.
With no soft pitches.
Okay, go. I think they need you to go to the mics because they're recording this, so.
Give Heather 2 mics. Heather, you want this one?
2 mics. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Craig Mock. I work for NPR Associates. We develop medical devices for our clients who like to hire us to do so. My question is, when you do connect all these devices into a larger system to act interoperably, what is the new medical device that you've just created, and why isn't that regulated as a system comprised of devices? And the other thought there is, who has the financial incentive to create their device such that it can be connected and share all this data?
So I'll try to answer not from a regulatory perspective per se, but from the IHE perspective, this loose coupling environment. If there are 2 or 3 medical devices, brand X infusion pump, brand Y, and brand B, models 1, 2, and 3, each company individually has chosen to be to create the interfaces and assumes the responsibility for their part of the safe operation. All of it's pointed to that one manufacturer. If they choose to design an interface to feed an electronic medical record, and that electronic medical record company chooses to have an interface to receive that data, each party is individually responsible. Now, when you start having a situation where the electronic medical record could raise an alert about an overdose and send a message back to 2 of the pumps, and they would accept that message and stop or reduce dosing. Now you have an interesting hybrid situation, but you could say that the claims made by each party was that they were prepared to send and receive and act on a certain range of messages, and that they retained the responsibility, liability in a courtroom, for the intrinsic behavior and safety of their individual product. And that there is no greater system unless the hospital has taken it upon themselves, which they do, to customize certain interfaces, certain programming parameters, certain network components, and then the hospital has probably become the manufacturer.
In the example you just gave, I'll ask Elliot a question. So in the example you just gave, I think the greater system here is the fact that the pump could have received incorrect data from another component, from the EMR or the laboratory system, and if it wasn't integrated correctly. So someone has to assure that it was done correctly, and someone might be responsible. That might be the greater system. Just to clarify, just to expand on your point.
Yeah,
For you.
I think this.
What you just described, I would call this type interchangeability, not necessarily interoperability, because you're defining a bunch of infusion pumps that behave the same way. Well, my concern is ventilators and infusion pumps and all these things interconnected together to increase patient safety. And obviously you need a supervisory system involved that has that responsibility to maintain that safety over and above the components.
So I'll put a plug in. There is a standard, the 80,001 standard, that intentionally addresses how you deal with risk in that kind of environment. But it puts the responsibility primarily on the healthcare organization. I mean, there are manufacturer responsibilities, but it primarily puts the responsibility on healthcare organizations. And right now, there's really no incentive for healthcare organizations or mandate or club or carrot or anything to use the 80,001 standard, because nobody's telling them that they have to. So you have that. The other thing at the summit, there were a lot of people talking about the need for a system integrator role in healthcare, that you have that in other high-risk industries like aviation and defense, and you don't have it in healthcare. But there are all kinds of incentive alignment issues. Who's going to have that role, and who can afford it? Who's going to pay for it? There isn't a natural system integrator.
And in analyzing the safety of the kind of example you gave, when you decompose that, you end up with one set of requirements that are related to the reliability of a command and control system, which is, again, well understood in industry. So you have the command and control, data reliability, communication, latencies, security, the host of those things, again, well understood. And then you have another piece that's related to the clinical decision support, or the app. And if you follow the model for things like that, I'll just speak for Heather. If you follow
Heather.
yeah. If you follow the current model for that, it is not unreasonable to expect that the devices retain their expectation of performance and liability. An infusion pump should be infusing or should be alarming or whatever it does, and Elliot touched on that. And then the supervisory algorithm that's responsible for this more sophisticated integration of data and execution of some command has its own, it's software as a medical device, and therefore it has its own expectation of performance, and it undergoes its own regulatory clearance. And perhaps that app might be a Class 3 app, or it might be a Class 2 app, it might be a simple information gathering app, it might be closed loop control or a smart alarm. And so you could organize the association of risk that way. And I say this because that's one approach, and we've, in our research program, have spent a considerable amount of time and arrived at that as a current model for the distribution of risk, and therefore looking at how to address that. And we don't have the answers, but that's where we are today.
Heather, and then microphone. We need to go to microphone number 2. You can stay up there if you want. If you have
I
more
was
of it.
just going to say, I mean, that is just the perfect example of the complexity of the issue, is that, you know, if somebody would come up with that integrated system from one company and come to the FDA, they would have that regulated as a device. And that's, you know, that's the issue here. So all of a sudden you have different devices within a particular hospital, and they're integrating them together. And that's where the gray area occurs, because these individual manufacturers have had, you know, the proper clearance for their devices as they made them, and then something else is going on. And I don't necessarily disagree with anything that Julian or Elliot has said here. I mean, it's hard unless you know the particulars of the complexity of that app and how that might be regulated.
It just says, I don't think it's all of a sudden. I mean, when I think about it, when you go back to anesthesia machines, and all of a sudden the state-of-the-art required that you had a Nellcor pulse oximeter stacked on the anesthesia machine to allow awareness of hypoxia. Now we had a system of disparate products that required a clinician to keep an eye on different things than they had been trained on in their residencies, and it became sort of the legal and then recording systems came into play to start recording what was happening in the anesthesia events. So I think we've had these assemblages emerging for a while, but what we're now seeing with ubiquitous wireless and wired networks and ubiquitous smart portable systems, it's happening so quickly that there are no rules, and we have to build some rules. We have to build some highways, some frameworks, some guidelines. And hopefully this doesn't get settled as is traditionally settled in our field in the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal instead of among scientists and engineers and physicians, as it should be.
Respectfully, 80,001 is not adequate to address what the device makers have to do to ensure that when they get into the hospital IT network,
Right. It's more for the hospital.
comply with whatever rules the hospital IT network
Right.
have.
It puts most of the burden on the hospitals. So give me your card and we can have more of a conversation about that. And this gentleman has been waiting very patiently to ask his question.
So I don't usually bring up the issue of EHRs and regulation, but since it was brought up by a number of folks, did I miss the
Note that the FDA did not bring that up, so they haven't
Yeah.
they haven't broken the truce.
did I miss the resolution or comment from a regulatory perspective? It seemed pretty clear that at least 50% of the panel, at least 100% of the panel that spoke to this issue, there's consensus that the EHR is a medical device. Why would it not be regulated?
So I will say that I don't disagree with the functions that were said of the EHRs and what goes on within the EHR. From my understanding, we've been exercising regulatory discretion, but we haven't actually said whether or not they are devices, and that really isn't, in my position, that isn't my place to say either way, so.
Good answer, Heather.
As Switzerland, I will say.
So as a regulator would say, that's above Heather's pay grade to
Yeah,
figure that
that's
out.
probably true.
Who does decide whether or not it's a medical device? Because it does actually, if you look at the definition of medical device put out by the FDA, it seems to qualify within the context of the definition of a medical device, because when you attach medical devices to a device, it then becomes a regulated device. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a whole system in place that if you had something and you came in and you wanted to decide whether it's a medical device, you would fill out a request for designation, and that's the process that goes on there. The thing with electronic medical records is it's more complex and political than that. I mean, we have different agencies involved, and it's just, from my understanding, and I'm sorry, I am not probably the most versed in this, but
You're doing really well, Heather. You're doing
Should we
trying
let
to
her
tread
dance?
lightly.
Or?
But, yeah, the final public decision has not really come out on that.
So a couple, let me, to take some of the pressure off, a couple of the points. One point is that the expectation is that a clinician is always involved in the decision, that the device isn't, that the EHR is not making the decision, that there's always a trained professional, so the product is one level removed from direct patient care.
kind of like a pump.
But
I understand.
Lots of devices don't make decisions.
But I'm just one of the
They're medical
arguments.
devices.
I'm not defending it, because remember, I'm the one that's been saying it's a medical device.
And by the way, I just want to just make it clear that my record of never bringing this issue up, it
Yes.
stands. I didn't bring the issue up.
Yes, that's me. And the other issue that has been made, another point has been made, is that the regulatory framework for FDA really has been adapted to electromechanical devices in CDRH. It's not really been around pure software devices. And so in an environment where we have, we've kind of inherited electronic medical records from billing systems, and they have add a lot of additional things to improve medical care. A discretionary decision has been made that in this moment in time it would be, if you just ripped out all the Epic systems in the country, take an extreme example, you'd stop half or two-thirds
If you
of
ripped out
medical
what?
care.
I'm sorry?
All of the Epic is a brand of medical system in maybe 51% of the hospitals and healthcare settings in the country. If you ripped that out, you would not improve healthcare. You would not improve safety. It would be a huge setback for the country. So this is a pragmatic decision and issue that is made for the moment. I don't think this is going to stay forever. I think this is just where we are at this instant. I don't like it either.
I didn't say I liked it or not liked it. I think it's just a very interesting.
I said
I think
I
most
don't like it.
And what's interesting is that I think you gave before pretty cogent reasons why it is a medical device, and it's just interesting that as a
Yes.
community, I'm part of the community too, as a community at this moment, at this point in the arc of technology adoption around health information technology in the healthcare community, we've decided collectively to pause.
To pause, right.
And then it's just interesting because it is a core, if not the core system today, especially at the rate of adoption, and yet we collectively have decided to pause on the regulatory issue.
And I think it is pause. I think we can all agree this isn't going to be the last conversation about that. Okay, purple shirt lady. You need to go to the mic because they're recording.
I know, he told you not to go to the mic because we're standing in front of the TV.
Oh, okay. Go to the mic.
Just stand to the right a little bit, we can get both. But if he answers, I can't get the shot.
It's okay. We're a friendly
Well,
crowd.
they don't like you either.
We're a friendly crowd.
I just stand to the right. Meaningful use in, I think, it was in the 800 pages of response.
Turn the microphone toward your mouth so they can hear you.
In the 800 pages of responses to comments about meaningful use, I think it was said in there that they were going to try to work on normalizing that situation, whatever that comes out at the end. And of course, meaningful use is a primary driver for certified EHRs. But I also wanted to go back to some of the things that we were talking about in terms of regulation and how these things happen in see, they're out to get me. In my company, many times the decision to go from something that's manual to something that's electronic is incremental and seems very simple. And it's, for me to say, well, if you do that, then you come under FDA rule is very threatening, but it's not very effective in terms of me being a partner to the development. I'm a security person, maybe you can tell. So my challenge is, short of that, to get people to think about what's going to happen down the road. So we have something that the patient is bringing in on a USB drive, and, well, why can't we just transfer it over the network? Wouldn't that be so much easier? And yes, that is good, but we start to get into a different risk. People are likely to become reliant on that. Decision makers are more likely to become reliant. I mean, if the patient forgets to bring it in, they'll do okay now. Once we're moving it automatically, it changes the overall paradigm and introduces new risks. And it's hard to get people to think about those small incremental things as being a major change in what's going to happen next.
I have to tell you a little story about. I trained in medical school in the late 1800s, and there's a phenomenon. There's a disorder called when there's fluid in the abdomen called ascites. It happens with liver disease and other things. A collection of fluid. It's quite important. Sometimes you have to remove some of the fluid. Sometimes you use it diagnostically. It's very important to know if someone has fluid freely in their abdomen. Back when I was in the 1800s, there was a test to find fluid in the abdomen. What you did is you had a patient get on all fours on the bed or wherever, and have them stay like that on all fours, on their knees and hands, so the fluid could collect at the lowest part of the abdomen, close to the belly button facing the floor. And then you'd put a stethoscope on the side of the abdomen, or the bottom, and you'd scratch with your finger or tap along the edges of the abdomen. This was a test described in the early diagnostic clinical manuals, probably close to 100 years earlier or something, I'm not sure. And so there's a sign, it's fully described in the textbooks on how to do this test. I'm not sure if any of you had to get down on all fours in your doctor's office lately for a physical exam to scratch your belly like a puppy. We don't, when is the last time that a doctor tried to diagnose a valve disorder of your heart with a stethoscope? All they do is they go, I think I heard something, go get an echocardiogram.
Yep.
Right? That's it. End of story. Or, oh, you have symptoms? Well, then there's nothing to even talk about. Go get an echocardiogram and an EKG and a treadmill test. Now, is there waste there? Sure. But the fact is, we never were any good at hearing this stuff. We just did our best with the tools that are available. And as bad as we were, we're worse because we don't practice any longer. So I can't, I haven't tested the puddle sign in so many years, I can't remember the details of it. But that may not be so bad. I mean, we were just doing the best with what we had. And it's the same thing today. We're dependent upon more information. Sure, if someone forgets to bring in their USB drive with data and there's dependency on data, that might be a problem. But would you rather collect all the data, each time? So that's the nature, of the changes. I used to do the timing on my VW 412 1973 wagon, and then years later I got a Volvo. I looked under the hood. I wasn't sure which part was the engine, which part was the computer. I shut the hood, went to the dealer. That's called progress. We can't maintain our cars anymore. And we're not going to be able to do certain things in healthcare. And I'm not judging it, but that's the nature of how things change.
Scary, I had the same car.
So we have 1 minute left. We'll take one last question.
I will make this very short, actually.
Yep.
I'm John Dwyer from Telcare. What I just wanted to say to folks there, thank you, because I think this interoperability thing is extremely difficult. A lot of people at this conference deal every day with the issue. But I think it's an interesting observation, which is I'd offer to the panel. The first is I was at the first mHealth conference, and there was less than 900 attendees. This year we're going to do 5,000 attendees. Now that there's a change in ownership in the conference, I suspect next year it'll see another 50% increase in size. That is a surrogate for how fast the market is growing. Second, we had an election. Elections have consequences, and the consequences of the healthcare cost problem. You regulators, the interoperability question, the market's going to overtake you. It's already probably past us, and we're playing catch-up. And so this conversation, and a lot of us that are in the industry, really need to think about completely backing up and changing the paradigm. So I'll leave you with this. I have a son who I'm very proud of, worked construction this summer, gets his first check, and freaks his mother out. Because he takes his phone and he scans his check into his phone and he deposits it into his Bank of America account. Now, the financial industry is not worried about whether that data is accurate. They are taking billions of dollars of transactions and billions of transactions, and they're perfectly comfortable validating them on the fly, and lots of money is exchanging hands. So the only question I'd have is, why can't we disengage data from hardware issues and data from clinical issues, because you might actually be able to you might be able to keep up with the industry if you do that. Otherwise, I think the politics of the situation will overtake us before we can regulate it.
Thought-provoking comment for closure. Does anyone have a pithy 30-second retort? Otherwise, we're done. Yes, Elliot.
I agree with you. I have yet to get Bill Gates' paycheck or his tax bill or his refund. So the systems do work pretty well, and I think we do have ways of exchanging data securely, reliably. I am told by colleagues in the banking industry they're about to move to 512-bit encryption, We could do that in healthcare as well. The military has ways of communicating securely, privately, moving data, moving images, IED detection. I think we can conquer a lot of these issues. I think Julie and I agreed to disagree that there's only one solution or way to solve these things, but I think that, as he said, we're doing the best we can right now.
Well, I would say...
Okay, Julian
I think-
gets the last word.
Yeah. So there's a very important distinction here. In areas, you have to look at these different environments. If you're building for the future, you build for those capabilities. ATMs, banking industry, and so forth, we're talking about decisions that were made and technologies that were applied and things are built for the future, especially smartphones. These are all modern devices. Taking legacy medical equipment and expecting it to act as a good citizen in an interoperable ecosystem is a different request entirely. And that's where we start to get into the notion of integration versus interoperability, keeping things loosely coupled until devices are updated and perform differently. So keep that in mind. It's a critical difference. We're working with legacy equipment, but moving forward, we have to have vision, clarity on what we want to achieve, a willingness to build new devices. And in answer to the question before about who's going to pay for that and who owns it, I can tell you that there's a document around that was worked on several years ago, signed by the VA, Partners Healthcare, Kaiser Permanente, and Johns Hopkins, saying we want to buy interoperable medical devices, and we want them on the market, and we want to purchase them. So even if we pay more for those capabilities, in the end, it's probably going to be less expensive for us because of the integration costs. So that's my summary on that.
Thank you. All right, so there will be a summit publication coming out by the end of the year. I've seen the first draft, and it's well on its way. It just will be ready to go by the end of the year. If you weren't at the summit, if you're not an AAMI member, then you want a copy, bring you your business card.
And before we go, Mary Logan deserves a round of applause for her leadership in this field. Thank you, Mary.
Aw. Thank you, Elliot. This was really fun.